Some decades, they just pass by. They're just a collection of years. But others are crucibles. They're these moments of incredible pressure and heat that just completely shatter old worlds and forge entirely new ones. Well, we're about to dive into one of those decades. A single 10-year span right at the dawn of the 4th century BCE that would redefine everything: power, philosophy, even the very art of war itself.
And as we go through this, I want you to keep one big question in the back of your mind. How are empires born from ashes? Because what we're about to see isn't just a story of destruction. No, it's a story of the radical, world-changing creation that came right after it. Okay, let's get into it.
So to set the stage, let's rewind the clock to 400 BCE. If you looked at a map of the known world, one power would just dominate your view: the Achaemenid Persian Empire. I mean, this thing was massive. It stretched across 3 continents, a colossal entity whose scale was just completely unmatched. For generations, Persia was the center of gravity. It was the undisputed superpower.
But here's the really interesting part. Persia's power wasn't just about the size of its armies or the land it held. Its foundations went so much deeper, right into its ideology, into its spirit. There was this unseen order that held this vast empire together.
And that order was defined by Zoroastrianism. At its very heart was this powerful idea of dualism, this belief in a constant cosmic war between a god of light, Ahura Mazda, and a force of darkness, Angra Mainyu. Now, this wasn't just a religion. This was the empire's identity. It was a core belief that they were on the side of universal order in this epic battle against chaos.
Okay, so you have this vision of a centralized cosmic order in Persia. Now, let's hop just a little bit to the west, to the Greek world. Things could not have been more different. Here, the basic unit wasn't a giant empire, it was the city-state, the polis. And while the ideal was all about order and rational democracy, the reality at the turn of the century, well, it was one of deep systemic failure. And nothing shows this failure more clearly than what happened in Athens in 399 BCE. The city's greatest philosophical mind, Socrates, was put to death by his own people. And why? Because in this atmosphere of political panic, this terror of mob rule, his constant questioning was seen as a threat. His execution wasn't just the death of one man. It was a symptom of a city in the middle of a profound intellectual and political crisis.
The fallout from that was immediate, and it was huge. Just 3 years after Socrates drank that cup of hemlock, one of his own students, a man named Antisthenes, he goes and founds a whole new school of thought, Cynicism. And its core idea? The world, the city, it's all so corrupt that the only virtuous path is to just withdraw completely, turn your back on it all. The death of Athens' great questioner led directly to a philosophy of just giving up. So you see the stark contrast, right? It's crucial. Over in Persia, you've got this sense of cosmic purpose and order holding everything together. But the Greek world, it's being consumed by a crisis of leadership, a crisis of its most basic political ideas, and this deep, nagging question about what civic virtue even means anymore. So we have these 2 great centers of civilization, one defined by purpose, the other paralyzed by crisis. But while they were wrestling with their own identities, another power was quietly, almost invisibly, growing on the Italian peninsula. A power that wouldn't be defined by philosophy, but by pure, relentless action. Of course, I'm talking about Rome. And everything changed for them in 390 BCE. The fuse was actually lit a few years earlier, when Rome decided to answer a call for help from a neighboring city that was being attacked by invading Gallic tribes. That one decision, well, it would bring an existential threat right to Rome's doorstep and trigger the city's absolute darkest hour. After completely smashing the Roman army in the field, the Gauls marched on the city itself. And the result was an absolute catastrophe. Rome was sacked, it was burned, it was brought to the very brink of total annihilation. This event left a deep, permanent scar on the Roman psyche. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a foundational trauma. And it was right out of the ashes of this unbelievable humiliation that a new Rome would be born, a Rome absolutely determined to make sure that this could never, ever happen again. Their response was radical. They didn't just rebuild the walls, they rebuilt their entire military philosophy. They threw out the defensive, standoff nature of the Greek spear, and they embraced a new, brutally effective weapon for up-close personal combat, the 2-foot sword. This was a fundamental shift from defense to relentless forward-pressing offense. And this sword was just part of a complete overhaul. The entire army was re-equipped. They developed new shields with iron edges that you could use for offense as well as defense. They adopted new protective breastplates, better helmets. This was a systematic, technological, top-to-bottom response to the shock of 390. And so, from the ashes of a sacked city, a totally new kind of army emerged. It was hardened, rearmed, and completely redefined by disaster. This single catastrophic decade forged and fired the relentless military machine that would, one day, conquer the known world. So in the end, that answer to our question, how are empires born from ashes? Well, I think it depends on the fire. For Rome, the flames of 390 BCE didn't just destroy, they purified, and what they left behind was an empire of iron and will.
You know, the 4th century BCE was this incredible mix of fire and philosophy. It was a time when old empires were showing their cracks, and brand new ideas about power, knowledge, and how to run a society were being hammered out. We're going to dive deep into one crucial 10-year span, the 380s BCE. It was a period of such intense, chaotic change that it literally reshaped the ancient world.
And the wild thing is, none of this was happening in a vacuum. From the warring courts in China to the bloody battlefields of Italy and all the way to the philosophical gardens of Athens, a new world was being forged, all at the same time. And our story really kicks off right at the start of the decade.
So, the decade opens with two very different people trying to impose some kind of order on the world. Way out in the east, in 389 BCE, the state of Chu hires this brilliant and frankly ruthless reformer named Wu Qi as its chancellor. His goal? To remake the state from the top down. At almost the exact same time, you've got the philosopher Plato sailing to Sicily, hoping he can convince a powerful dictator to try out a government based on reason. Two totally different approaches to power.
Now, what Wu Qi was trying to do in Chu was nothing short of a revolution. He went right after the powerful nobles, launching these massive anti-corruption campaigns. I mean, this was all based on legalism, a philosophy that said the state and its strict laws were more important than anything else. He wanted to build this hyper-efficient, centralized machine, and in the process, he made some really, really dangerous enemies. This was basically an early test run of the very ideas that would, about 150 years later, be used to brutally unify all of China.
Okay, the year 387 BCE was just a total pressure cooker. In Greece, a long, grinding war finally ends, and it leaves Sparta on top, mostly thanks to Persian money. At the same time, this up-and-coming power you might have heard of, Rome, is brought to its knees. Gallic warriors completely sack the city, burning it down. And then, back in Athens, a deeply disappointed Plato comes home and starts a school that will literally shape Western civilization for thousands of years. The Academy. What a year.
And right there, that's the central conflict of the entire age, playing out at the exact same moment. Over in Athens, you have this profound belief that you can perfect the world with ideas, with rational thought. And then, just a short boat ride away in Italy, you get the brutal lesson that a state and all its big ideas can be wiped out by sheer force.
At the core of Plato's brand new academy was this absolutely radical idea, the philosopher king. You have to remember, he had watched Athenian democracy vote to execute his mentor, Socrates, so he was done with rule by the mob. He was done with rule by the rich, he was done with rule by the strongest. He argued that power should only belong to the wise. It was a revolutionary concept for a government run not by armies or votes, but by pure intellect.
And Plato's own words just show you how huge his ambition was. This wasn't some abstract thought experiment for him. He genuinely believed the survival and happiness of the entire human race depended on getting this right. That unless you could unite wisdom and power in the same person, society was just doomed to keep repeating the same cycles of violence and corruption forever.
So while Plato is busy building a school for ideas, Rome is literally rebuilding itself from the ashes. And the sack of their city, well, it wasn't the end of Rome. It was a crucible. That trauma forged a new, ruthless kind of determination. The Romans rebuilt their walls and their army not just to survive, but with this fierce belief that no one would ever do that to them again. That moment put them on the path to conquering everything.
When you look at this decade, you really see two competing visions for how power should work. Over in the East, Wu Qi's model is all about centralization, creating a powerful state that crushes all local loyalties for the sake of efficiency. But in the Greek world, power was all about hegemony, a messy system where one strong city-state, like Sparta, uses a web of alliances and threats to keep a fragile peace over its rivals.
Now, this new peace in Greece, enforced by Sparta, it had major ripple effects. Because the Greeks weren't busy fighting each other anymore, the real superpower of the day, the Persian Empire, was free to get back to business. They turned their armies toward rebellious places like Egypt and Cyprus. Meanwhile, back in Athens, Plato's intellectual project becomes a real, physical place. His academy is officially founded, a beacon of learning that would shine for centuries to come.
But not everyone was celebrating this new peace. In 384 BCE, the orator Lysias gets up and publicly shames his fellow Greeks for taking Persian money and bowing to their influence. So the tension is still simmering just beneath the surface. And while the politicians are arguing, something much quieter but maybe even more profound is happening. In 383 BCE, Babylonian astronomers figure out the 19-year lunar cycle. This was a massive leap forward in tracking time accurately, which is just crucial for everything from farming to religion.
And then, in 381 BCE, that huge experiment in reform over in Chu comes to a bloody, dramatic end. At the funeral for his one protector, King Dao, Wu Qi is cornered by the very aristocrats whose power and wealth he'd taken away. They murdered him, right there on the spot. It was a violent, brutal backlash from the old guard, and it worked.
And here's the key takeaway from that. Wu Qi's reforms, as brilliant as they were completely tied to the strength of one man. When he was killed, his system basically died with him. But Plato's academy was totally different. It was an institution built to protect an idea, designed from the get-go to outlive its founder. And it makes you wonder, what really lasts? The individual reformer or the Reformation itself?
As the decade comes to a close in 380 BCE, you see Persia still flexing its muscles, using diplomatic pressure to get what it wants in Egypt. But at the exact same time, another great power, Carthage, is spreading its influence in a totally different way. Now with armies, now with threats, but with camel caravans and one single, world-changing commodity.
For Carthage, trading iron across the Sahara was probably just a good business decision. But what they accidentally unleashed was a technological revolution thousands of miles away. Suddenly, iron smelting pops up in West Africa. This new tech meant better tools, more food, and deadlier weapons. It kicks off a population boom and turbocharges the Great Bantu Migration, this centuries-long expansion of people and language that would go on to define the cultural map of almost an entire continent. A single trade route, open for profit, was fundamentally changing the future of Africa.
So you look back at this one chaotic decade, and you see a world just buzzing with change. Reformers rise and fall, cities are burned and rebuilt, empires push their power through armies, through big ideas, and through simple trade. The 380s really set the stage. All the pieces were there: ruthless military efficiency, the towering ambition of a philosopher king, and the engine of a global economy. The only thing missing was someone who could come along and wield them all at once.
All right, let's open the Chronicle. We're looking at a single, absolutely pivotal decade, 379 to 370 BCE. Now, this wasn't just any 10-year stretch of time. This was an age of incredible volatility, a moment when the very tectonic plates of the ancient world shifted, and an entire geopolitical order just came crashing down. So as this decade begins, the world is really standing on a knife's edge. You look to the east, and the vast Persian Empire is still, for all intents and purposes, the global superpower. Its authority stretches across 3 continents, immense, but maybe a little fragile. Over in the west, the tyrant Dionysius of Syracuse is busy carving out his own powerful domain. But right in the heart of the Greek world, one power stood above everyone else. And that power, of course, was Sparta. For decades, they were the undisputed masters of Greece, the self-appointed arbiters of, well, everything. Their reputation was built on the backs and the shields of their hoplites, an image of absolute, unflinching military might. But, being the top dog breeds resentment, and underneath that marble facade, Sparta's power was becoming dangerously brittle. And here's the fascinating part. When you look at the timeline, Sparta basically set the stage for its own downfall. After the Corinthian War ends in 387, they don't relax, they push harder. They interfere in other cities' business, they install garrisons, they encroach further and further, just tightening that grip until the rest of Greece felt like it was suffocating. By 379, all that simmering anger was just about ready to boil over. And up in the city of Thebes, a challenger was rising. The difference in how they thought about war is just stark. Sparta really represented the past, that traditional, rigid hoplite phalanx. It's a wall of shields and spears. It's powerful for sure, but it's completely inflexible. Thebes, on the other hand, was forging the future. They were developing new tactics that were all about flexibility, about depth, about exploiting an enemy's weakness at one single critical point. A new way of thinking was on a collision course with the old way. So let's jump to the year that changed everything, 371 BCE. On a dusty plain called Leuctra, all the tension, all the resentment, all the tactical genius of the last decade, it all erupted in one world-altering battle. This was the moment of reckoning. You have to understand, for a century, the myth of Spartan invincibility had basically policed the Greek world. The idea that a Spartan army could actually be defeated in a head-to-head fight was, well, it was unthinkable. But at Leuctra, the Thebans turned that myth to dust. They didn't meet strength with strength. Instead, they loaded up one of their flanks, creating this overwhelming local superiority that just shattered the Spartan line. It wasn't just a win. It was a tactical revolution, one that would have consequences that no one on that field could have possibly imagined. And it all comes down to this one single devastating number: 700. Now, for any other city-state, losing 700 soldiers would have been bad. For Sparta, whose elite citizen body was already critically small, it was a full-blown catastrophe. 700 of their best warriors gone in a single afternoon. It was a blow from which their military system would never, ever recover. And the result of that single number was absolute. This broken helmet, it symbolizes so much more than just a defeated army. It represents the end of an entire era. The Spartan hegemony, the political and military reality that had defined the Greek world for generations, was over. It was shattered right there on the fields of Leuctra. But here's the thing. The fall of a giant doesn't bring peace. It creates a void. With Sparta humbled, a massive power vacuum opened up right in the heart of Greece. The old policeman was gone, the old alliances were broken, and the entire system was thrown into total chaos. And into this vacuum, new, ambitious powers began to look. So who were the heirs to this broken world? Well, you have to look to the edges of the map. Up north, in Macedon, a young king named Philip II was watching, and he was learning, and he was forging a whole new kind of army. And way over to the west, on the Italian peninsula, a growing republic called Rome was fighting these brutal wars in rugged mountains, forcing them to develop their own unique and very flexible way of fighting. This new era was going to be defined by military innovation. You had Macedon, who developed the Sarissa, a pike so long it created this unstoppable forest of spear points, and they combined it with the hammer blow of heavy cavalry. And then you had Rome, creating the Manipular Legion, a flexible, standardized force that could adapt to pretty much any terrain. These were the weapons that were going to shape the next 200 years of history. And the connection here is just astonishingly direct. Philip of Macedon had actually spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes. He saw their tactical genius firsthand. He studied the very methods that broke Sparta. And when he went home, he didn't just copy them, he perfected them. He created the professional combined arms military machine that his son, Alexander, would one day lead to the ends of the known world. At the exact same time, Rome was having its own military awakening. In these brutal wars against the Samnites, the old Greek-style phalanx was failing them in the mountains. So they evolved. They broke the phalanx down into these smaller, much more flexible units called maniples, creating an army that was disciplined, standardized, and just brutally effective. In their own little corner of the world, they were preparing for an empire. And so we end right here with this question. The collapse of Sparta between 379 and 370 BCE wasn't just the end of a Greek story. No, it was the catalyst that unleashed the forces of the future. The fall of this one great power created the space for two others to rise, setting in motion the conquests of Alexander and the unstoppable expansion of Rome. It just goes to show how a single decade can unravel a world, and in doing so, create the one that's yet to come.
You know, history doesn't really move in a straight line. It's more like a collision, a crash of moments, of big ideas and powerful ambitions. And if you look closely at the decade before Alexander the Great ever took the throne, you'll see these incredible seismic shocks cracking the very foundations of the old world, shocks that were paving the way for a whole new era of empire.
So, take a look at this map. It shows a world of ancient, established powers, but don't let those familiar borders fool you for a second. From the heart of Persia to the shores of the Mediterranean, and all the way across the plains of China, something deep and volatile was brewing. The old certainties were just dissolving, and that was creating a power vacuum on a scale the world had truly never seen before.
The early 360s BCE. This was a time of profound crisis, of real instability. From northern Greece to the heartlands of China, the institutions and ideas that had governed for centuries were being pushed to their absolute breaking point. This wasn't just another decade of wars and politics as usual. No, this was the crucible where the next 1,000 years of history were about to be forged.
Now, the dominant power on the world stage, the big one, was the Achaemenid Persian Empire. I mean, this was the planet's first true superpower, a colossal state stretching all the way from India to Egypt. But its sheer size was also its greatest weakness. Control was stretched incredibly thin, and deep fractures were starting to show. You had rebellious governors, violent succession crises that shook the throne itself. The giant was starting to stumble.
And meanwhile, over in the Greek world, the legendary city-states were literally bleeding themselves dry. Generations of just brutal, grinding warfare had left them totally exhausted and financially ruined. The whole era of the citizen soldier, that hoplite phalanx that had famously defeated Persia a century earlier, well, that era was drawing to a close. Their entire model of war and society was just proving to be too rigid, too slow for this new, more dangerous world.
So, as these old powers in the West were faltering, a completely radical new answer to the question of state power was emerging over in the East. This was during China's incredibly bloody Warring States period. And this new idea, it wasn't about tradition or philosophy in the way the Greeks thought about it. No, it was about something far more ruthless, absolute, centralized control. And this man is the architect of that new model, Shang Yang. He was a statesman and a political theorist in the state of Qin. Now, the ruler of Qin, Duke Xiao, had tasked him with restoring the state's honor through, and I quote, unusual stratagems. And let me tell you, Shang Yang took that mandate to its most extreme and logical conclusion.
Shang Yang's entire philosophy could really be boiled down to this one idea. He argued by clinging to old rituals and traditions, what he called the way, or Tao, was just a path to weakness and ruin. The only thing that mattered was the craft, or shu, brutally effective statecraft that gets real, measurable results.
And he put this into practice with a revolutionary set of reforms. He created something called the hukou, which was a household registration system that gave the state this unprecedented control over its people. He basically locked the population into farming to create a massive surplus to fuel the army. But his most radical innovation, by far, was in how that army was motivated.
In Shang Yang's new system, your social status, your land, your entire position in society, it was all determined by one thing, your performance on the battlefield. And that performance was measured in the number of enemy heads you could bring back. It was a terrifyingly effective meritocracy built on pure violence, and it was designed to turn the entire state of Qin into an unstoppable engine of war.
Now, at the very same time this revolution in statecraft was happening in the East, a completely different kind of experiment was unfolding in the West. Here, the central question wasn't about raw power, but about the very nature of truth and justice, and whether an idea alone could shape a ruler.
In 367 BCE, the great philosopher Plato travels to Syracuse. See, Plato believed that our world was just a shadow of a higher, perfect reality, a world of forms, where concepts like perfect justice and perfect beauty actually existed. His mission? To educate the young tyrant Dionysius II to see beyond the shadows of his court and rule according to these perfect ideals, to create a real-life philosopher king. He was literally trying to impose abstract truth onto the messy, violent reality of a Sicilian tyrant's court.
Okay, now get this. In the very same year that Plato arrived in Syracuse with all his abstract ideals, a profoundly different kind of political evolution was taking place just across the sea in Italy. This was way less about perfecting a single ruler and a whole lot more about building a resilient state through tough, practical reform. And it was all happening in a small but very ambitious republic called Rome.
So while Plato was trying to mold a perfect ruler from the top down, the Romans were building a more durable state from the bottom up. These laws, the Licinian-Sextian Laws, were a landmark reform. They finally allowed commoners, the plebeians, to be elected to the consulship, the highest office in the Republic. It was a concrete, practical step that brought a huge part of the population into the state, gave them a real stake in its future, and made Rome stronger for centuries to come.
All right, let's move now to our third theater of change. We're going north of Greece to a kingdom that the sophisticated Athenians considered, well, backward and barbarian. This was Macedon, and it was on the verge of a military revolution that wouldn't just conquer Greece, but would shatter the Persian Empire and change the entire world forever.
But in the year 360 BCE, things had never, ever looked more hopeless for Macedon. Its king had just been killed in battle, and the kingdom was being completely overrun by invading Balkan tribes. Honestly, it looked for all the world like Macedon was about to be wiped from the map entirely.
And then, out of this moment of absolute crisis, a new leader emerged. Philip II, the late king's younger brother, seized control. And he wasn't just planning on saving Macedon. Oh no, he was going to re-engineer it into the most formidable war machine the ancient world had ever seen.
Philip's innovations were just systematic and brilliant. First, he created a professional army, paid by the state and loyal only to him. Then he armed them with the Sarissa, this monstrously long pike, 15 to 18 feet long, that could outreach any Greek spear. He forged his nobles into the Companion Cavalry, an elite hammer to his infantry's anvil. And he backed it all up with a mobile siege train that could take down any walled city that got in his way.
When you lay it all out like this, you can really see just how revolutionary Philip's approach was. The Greeks were still relying on that dense healed wall. The Romans were developing a more flexible system. But what Philip created, it was a true combined arms force. The Sarissa gave him incredible reach, and the cavalry gave him a decisive, brutal shock power that no other army on earth could match.
So, what happens when you put all these pieces together? You've got three different corners of the world, three radical new ideas about how to build and wield power, all emerging in the exact same narrow window of time. What was being forged here was nothing less than the future of empire.
Let's just recap this incredible decade. In 367, Rome strengthens its republic from the inside, while Plato fails to build an ideal monarchy from the outside. Just a few years later, Shang Yang begins his totalizing reforms in Qin. Then, in 360, Philip takes over a broken Macedon and starts building his invincible army. And at the exact same time, even in Jerusalem, new laws were codifying the power of the priesthood, creating a new, more rigid social order. The whole world was reorganizing itself at once.
Look, these were not isolated events. The seeds of the great empires that would dominate the next era of human history, the unified China of Qin, the vast Hellenistic kingdoms born from Alexander's conquests, and of course the unstoppable Roman Republic, were all sown in this one remarkable decade. New ideas about law, about citizenship, and about warfare were laying the groundwork for a new imperial age.
The changes that took place between 369 and 360 BCE provided the answer. This single decade wasn't just a prelude to the age of Alexander, it was the moment the old world died and the blueprints for the new one were drawn. Which leaves us with a fascinating question to consider. What happens the next time the world's foundations begin to crack?
You know, we always think of history as these big, flashy moments, right? The famous battles, the big names. But what if I told you that sometimes the really profound changes, the ones that literally shape centuries, happen in these quiet, overlooked decades? Well, this is the story of one of those times. A decade where all across the globe, the seeds of a new world were being planted. And the crazy part? Most of these rising powers and brilliant thinkers had absolutely no idea the others even existed.
So, let's set the scene. It's 359 BCE. And for all intents and purposes, the world has one single superpower, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. I mean, just look at this thing. It's colossal, stretching all the way from the Balkans to the Indus Valley. For 200 years, they've been calling the shots. But if you look really closely at the edges of this map, you'll start to see it. While Persia looks untouchable, there's something stirring out there on the fringes. You can almost see the cracks starting to form in that old imperial armor.
And of all places, the future was murkiest right here, in Macedon.
I mean, to the sophisticated Greeks down in Athens and Sparta, these guys were basically rough-and-tumbled barbarians from the sticks. And in 359, Macedon was an absolute disaster. Their king had just been killed in battle, their army was a mess, and they were teetering on the edge of total collapse. Seriously, if you were picking a place to launch a world-changing revolution, this would be the last spot on your list.
But you know what they say, crisis creates opportunity. And stepping right into that chaos was the late king's younger brother, a guy named Philip. And let me tell you, Philip wasn't just some placeholder regent trying to keep the lights on. Oh no, this guy was a visionary. He had this absolutely radical plan to take Macedon from a backwater mess and forge it into a lean, mean, centralized military machine.
And this is where we get into the nuts and bolts of his genius. Philip didn't just tweak the old army. He threw out the playbook and invented a whole new kind of war machine. He gave his infantry the Sarissa, this insane 18-foot-long pike that created a hedgehog of death nobody could get through. Then he took his nobles and turned them into the elite Companion Cavalry, the perfect hammer to the flanks' anvil. And to connect them, he created these flexible troops, the Hypastists. Add a professional siege unit to that, you've got a true combined arms force. Nothing like it had ever existed before. It was a complete game changer. And the speed. My God, the speed of it all was just staggering. We're talking 2 years. In just 2 years, Philip went from a kingdom on its knees to fielding a professional army of over 10,000 soldiers. With this force, he kicked out the invaders, locked down his borders, and then he started to look further. A new power had officially arrived on the scene. So, while Philip is busy building this incredible new military machine up in Macedon, the old world order is starting to come apart at the seams. The Persian Empire, that giant that had kept things stable for so long, yeah, it was dealing with its own set of problems, especially out on its shaky western frontier. And this really just paints a picture of the total interconnected chaos of the time. While Persia's dealing with revolts, what are the Greek city-states doing? Uniting against a common foe? Nope. They're diving headfirst into their own petty, self-destructive wars. The social war, the sacred war, it was a mess that just drained their resources and showed everyone how divided they were. You even had powerful Persian governors like Mausolus basically acting like they were independent kings. The whole area was just a giant power vacuum, begging for someone to step in.
But hold on, Philip's Macedon wasn't the only up-and-comer on the block. If we pan way out to the west, over on the Italian peninsula, another state was quietly, methodically getting its act together, learning from every fight and slowly but surely starting to dominate its neighbors. And that was, of course, the Roman Republic.
And this right here, this was a huge moment for early Rome. I mean, think about it. They make a smart, strategic alliance with the tough Samnite tribes, and together they take down the Etruscans. This shows they're getting smarter, more organized, and just relentless. You're literally watching the foundations of the Roman legions being laid brick by bloody brick, war by war.
Okay, now let's zoom the map out even further, because what's happening isn't just a Mediterranean thing. This is a global story. Half a world away, with zero contact with anything we've talked about so far, the kingdoms of ancient China are deep in their own epic, century-long throwdown for control, the legendary Warring States period.
And don't for a second think this was just a few tribes throwing spears at each other. No way. Take the Battle of Guiling in 353 BCE. This was a massive, sophisticated battle with brilliant strategies and enormous armies. It's wild because the sheer scale of the fighting, the new ideas about warfare, it was almost a mirror image of the innovations Philip was bringing to the table back in the West. It really feels like the entire world was being reforged in fire at the exact same time.
But what's so fascinating about this decade is that it wasn't all about armies clashing. There was another kind of battle going on, a battle for the mind. While all this fighting was happening, you could go to Athens, and there, the legendary philosopher Plato was in his final years. He was teaching a new generation at his academy to, ignore the messy chaos of the real world and to look for a higher, more perfect truth in the realm of ideas.
And amazingly, at the very same time, a completely separate intellectual revolution was kicking off in India. But here, it wasn't about abstract ideas in the same way. It was about cementing a culture through the sheer power of storytelling. For centuries, these incredible stories had just been passed down by word of mouth, and now they were finally being written down, locked into their final epic forms. And you really can't overstate how huge this was. By putting the Ramayana and the Mahabharata down on paper, they weren't just writing stories. They were building the entire moral and cultural bedrock for the Indian subcontinent, a foundation that would last for millennia. It defined everything: duty,
honor, what it means to be good. In its own way, it was creating a unique path for a civilization, just like Plato's work was doing for the West. So let's step back. As this decade winds down around 350 BCE, the world is pregnant with possibility. A new world is trying to be born. The old Persian superpower looks shaky. You've got this ferocious new military power in Macedon. An ambitious, hungry Roman Republic is on the move. China's states are locked in a deathmatch, and brand new ideas are changing how everyone sees everything. The chessboard is set, all the pieces are in motion. So the big question is, who's going to make the next move? And who's going to win it all?
Well, the wild thing is, the answer was already there. Nobody knew it yet, but he had already been born. Back in 356 BCE, in the Macedonian court at Pella, Philip II had a son. His name was Alexander. This kid would inherit that unstoppable army his father built. He'd be tutored by Aristotle, who was Plato's best student, and then, in one violent, breathtaking campaign that would change everything, he would be the one to smash all these separate developing worlds together and drag them kicking and screaming into a completely new age.
You know, when we think about history, our minds usually jump to the big, famous conquests, the names everyone recognizes. But sometimes the really critical shifts, the ones that change everything, happen in those quiet moments right before the storm. We're going to dive into one of those moments right now. A single, overlooked decade from 349 to 340 BCE. This was a time of incredibly violent, profound change that was quietly redrawing the map of the ancient world. And man, was it setting the stage for the empires to come?
All right, so let's get our bearings. Picture the world in 349 BC. Over in the east, you've got the massive Persian Empire, but it's kind of like a giant on shaky legs, struggling to keep its provinces in line. Then there's Greece, home of the legendary city-states like Athens and Thebes, but they're weakened, totally drained from fighting each other for decades. But look closer. Out on the edges of this old world, something new is stirring. Up north, the kingdom of Macedon is building an army like nothing anyone's ever seen. And over on the Italian peninsula, a tough little republic called Rome is just starting to stretch its legs.
For most of this decade, the whole story is really driven by two immense forces, operating at opposite ends of the sea. In Macedon, you have this brilliant and absolutely ruthless king, Philip II. He's forging a new kind of military, a hammer, really, just poised to smash the old order to pieces. And way over in Persia, the great king Artaxerxes III is wielding the empire's navy, its trident, to brutally take back everything it had lost.
And get this, between 349 and 348, two major events went down with this terrifying symmetry. While Philip of Macedon was laying siege to and just completely leveling the Greek city of Olynthus, Artaxerxes of Persia was doing almost the exact same thing to the rebellious port of Sidon. The message that shot across the ancient world was loud and clear. A new, much more ruthless era of power had begun. Defy us, and you will be annihilated.
But Philip of Macedon, wow, his genius wasn't just about what he could do on the battlefield. He got it. He understood that real, lasting power came from controlling not just your enemies, but your allies too. So after his brutal northern campaigns, he put down the sword for a minute and picked up the subtle tools of diplomacy and political gamesmanship.
So in 346 BCE, this treaty called the Peace of Philocrates gets signed, officially ending the war with Athens. But for Philip, this wasn't just a peace treaty. Oh no, it was a political masterstroke. He used the opportunity to march his army right into the heart of Greece, not as a conqueror, but as a peacekeeper, supposedly to settle some local religious squabbles. And just like that, by doing so, he made himself the ultimate authority in all Greek affairs. Macedon wasn't some backwater kingdom anymore. It was the new center of the entire Greek world.
Okay, so while Philip's shadow is falling over mainland Greece, a totally different kind of story is playing out somewhere else in the Greek world. It's a story that almost feels like an echo from an older time, you know? An era of heroes and city-states, maybe one last stand for an older way of life.
Over in Sicily, the great city of Syracuse was just suffering under a tyrant. In response, the city of Corinth sent a general, a guy named Timoleon. And between 344 and 343, he pulls off something almost unthinkable in this new age of empires. He actually kicks the tyrant out and liberates the city. It was this heroic, old-fashioned fight for freedom, a total contrast to the imperial chess game Philip was playing back in Greece.
But what if the biggest revolution of the whole decade wasn't happening on a battlefield or in some king's court? What if it was actually happening inside the mind of a single person? Someone who was offering a totally new way to see the world just as that world was being turned upside down.
Right around the same time, a revolution of the mind was kicking off. In 344 BCE, the philosopher Aristotle, who had been a student of Plato, made a huge break from his teacher. He basically rejected Plato's whole world of abstract, perfect ideas and instead argued for empiricism, the belief that true knowledge doesn't come from thinking about perfection, it comes from observing the physical, messy, real world all around us. In an age where old political certainties were collapsing, Aristotle was offering a brand new way to understand reality itself. And while this incredible revolution of the mind was happening, that tangible, messy world just kept being relentlessly violent. So as Aristotle was rethinking reality, the great kings were out there conquering it. Philip was campaigning nonstop in the north, securing his borders with an iron fist. Artaxerxes, looking to get back Persia's wealth and prestige, finally marched south and reconquered the vital, rebellious province of Egypt. And Philip, he immediately launched another campaign, just swallowing up huge territories in Thrace. The world was literally being remade by sword and spear.
But while these two giants of the East, Persia and Macedon, were clashing and expanding, that other power we talked about, the one on the fringe, was quietly making its move. Let's look west again, because a new force was gathering steam, a power that would one day, believe me, challenge them all, the Roman Republic.
In 343 BCE, Rome went to war, but this wasn't some desperate fight for survival. This was a war of intervention. They answered a call for help from their neighbors against a really tough tribe of warriors called the Samnites. This was no small-time squabble. This was Rome's first major test of expansion. You could say the wolf cub was learning how to hunt.
And let me tell you, Rome proved to be an incredibly fast learner. First, they intervened, which led straight to battle. At the Battle of Mount Gaurus, the Roman legions won a huge, decisive victory, proving how tough they were. But Rome's real genius was its ability to combine military wins with smart political moves. The very next year, they passed new laws to strengthen their republic from the inside out. It was this mix of battlefield skill and internal reform that created this powerful, resilient engine for conquest.
And that engine was immediately put to the ultimate test. By 340 BCE, Rome's own allies in the Latin League saw the writing on the wall. They realized they were quickly becoming subjects, not partners, and so they rose up in a massive rebellion. This launched a war that would decide, once and for all, who was going to be the master of central Italy.
It's just amazing when you step back. In the span of a single decade, the entire geopolitical map was redrawn. In 349, Macedon and Rome were just regional players. But by 340, Macedon was the undisputed master of Greece, and Rome was on the verge of conquering all of Italy. The old world order had completely crumbled, and two new empires were rising up to take its place.
So this is it. This is the world at the end of our decade. The areas of influence for Macedon and Rome aren't just little smudges on the map anymore. They are solid, they are expanding, and they are on a collision course with the old powers. The stage has been completely cleared for a new act in the drama of history.
So the foundations for a new age have been laid, in blood and in thought. Philip of Macedon has unified Greece, and now he's looking east toward the unbelievable wealth of Persia. Rome is tightening its grip on Italy, getting ready to look out across the sea. The question hanging over the entire world in 340 BCE is a simple one. With the board reset and the new pieces in place, whose move is it next?
You know, empires aren't supposed to die overnight. They're built over generations, forged in war, in politics. They feel permanent. But what if I told you one of history's greatest superpowers was just shattered in less than a decade? Well, this is that story, the story of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and its shockingly fast collapse.
For 200 years, this was the giant of the ancient world, no question. Its power stretched all the way from the mountains of Greece to the Indus River. We're talking 3 continents, home to something like 40% of the entire world's population at the time. So how does an empire like that just disappear in 10 years? That's the question we're diving into.
And to really understand this incredible conquest, our story doesn't start with the conqueror you're thinking of. No, it starts with his father, the man who actually forged the weapon that would change the world, Philip II of Macedon.
In just a few short years, Philip completely rewrote the rules of power. In 339 BCE, he secures his northern borders against the Scythians.
A year later, bam, at Chaeronea, he crushes the combined might of Athens and Thebes, basically ending the whole era of Greek independence. By 337, he's got the Greek states all unified in a single league for one reason and one reason only: a massive, all-Greek invasion of Persia. The stage is set, the army's ready to go, but then, right on the eve of his greatest campaign, he's assassinated.
Now this was the engine of Philip's revolution. He took a bunch of part-time farmers and turned them into a full-time professional war machine, the Pezzeteratoi, or the Foot Companions. We're talking about an 18,000-strong infantry corps, state-funded, constantly drilled, and incredibly disciplined. The world had just never seen anything like it.
And their terrifying advantage? It was this weapon, the Sarissa, a massive pike, sometimes stretching up to 18 feet long. When they locked into formation, you'd have 5 spear points projecting in front of every single soldier, creating this impenetrable forest of death. It was a weapon that didn't just win fights, it let the Phalanx literally roll over the enemy with this unstoppable, crushing force.
But you can't conquer the world with infantry alone. Philip knew that, so he also took the wild Macedonian nobles and molded them into the most elite heavy cavalry of the age, the Hetairoi, the Companion Cavalry. Their job wasn't to hold a line. Their job was to be the decisive killing blow, the hammer that shattered the enemy at just the right moment.
You see, these two forces were designed to work together perfectly in Philip's signature hammer and anvil tactic. The strategy was brutally simple but so effective. The phalanx, that's the anvil, would march forward and pin the enemy army, just hold them in place. Then when the moment was right, the companion cavalry, the hammer, would slam into their side or their back. It was a combined arms system that was just about unbeatable.
So Philip had created the perfect army, this incredible war machine ready to take on Asia. But he would never get to lead it. After his assassination in 336 BCE, the weapon he'd spent his life forging passed into the hands of his son. And that son was Alexander, just 20 years old, a young, untested kid, inheriting a kingdom that was far from stable and a world-changing war. To all the experts watching across Greece, it probably looked like the whole Macedonian moment was over before it even really started.
Oh, how wrong they were. In a single brutal year, 335 BCE, Alexander didn't just prove he was competent, he proved he was absolutely ruthless. First, he force marches his army north to smash rebellions in Thrace and Illyria, securing his borders. Then, he hears the Greek city of Thebes has revolted, so he races his army south, 240 miles in just 2 weeks. And he doesn't just beat Thebes, he razes it to the ground, sells 30,000 people into slavery. The message, written in blood and ash, was crystal clear. There's a new master in Greece, and you do not challenge him.
With his backyard brutally secured, Alexander turned his full attention to his father's great dream. In the spring of 334 BCE, he led his army across the Hellespont. He left Europe behind and marched straight into the heart of the Persian Empire. The invasion was on.
The local Persian governors, the satraps, they met him almost immediately at the Granicus River. In a battle that honestly could have ended his campaign and his life right then and there, Alexander led this insane, death-defying charge across the river, right into the teeth of the enemy. He almost died, for real, but the Macedonians won a stunning victory. And just like that, the door to Asia Minor was kicked wide open.
And with that first shocking victory, what came next was less of a normal war and more like the complete and violent shattering of an entire world order.
The whole conquest unfolded with just breathtaking speed. In 333 BCE, at Issus, Alexander comes face to face with the great king himself, Darius III, and forces him to flee the battlefield, leaving his own family behind. A year later, he does the impossible. He conquers the island fortress of Tyre, then marches into Egypt, where they welcome him as a liberator. The next year, 331, is the final epic showdown at Gaugamela. And by 330, the spiritual heart of the empire, Persepolis, is his.
But look, this wasn't just about being brilliant on the battlefield. It was a masterpiece of logistics. Think about it. The Persians were defending their home turf. Alexander had to supply an army deep in enemy territory. He was arranging markets ahead of his army, establishing supply lines, and using scouts not just to find the enemy, but to find food and water. This planning was the invisible engine that was driving the entire conquest.
But if you had to pick one battle that sealed the empire's fate, it has to be Gaugamela.
This time, Darius had learned his lesson. He picked the battlefield himself, a huge, flat plain, perfect for his scythed chariots and his massive advantage in cavalry numbers. By all rights, this should have been it. This is where the Macedonian war machine was supposed to get swallowed up and destroyed.
Instead, Alexander pulls off a tactical masterpiece, and the Persian army was broken for good. The final symbolic moment came in 330 BCE. Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial capital, was burned to the ground. We don't know if it was an accident or a deliberate act of revenge, but the message was the same. The age of the Achaemenids was over.
And Darius III? He was a fugitive in his own empire, fleeing east, but his authority was gone. His own officials, led by a satrap named Bessus, betrayed him and murdered him, probably hoping to get on the winner's good side. With the death of the great king, the last bit of organized resistance just fell apart. Alexander of Macedon was now the undisputed ruler of Persia.
And that leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? Was this incredible 10-year collapse really all down to the superhuman genius of one man? Or was the Achaemenid Empire, after 200 years, already in decline? A hollow giant, full of dissent and intrigue, just waiting for someone to come along and give it a firm push.
All right, let's set the scene. It's 329 BCE. Alexander the Great has already completely shattered the Persian Empire, and now he's pushing his Macedonian army, this force that seems absolutely invincible, to the very edge of the known world. I mean, they're crossing the Hindu Kush, marching into these vast unknown lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, what we'd call Afghanistan and Central Asia today. This isn't just another campaign. This is a journey that's literally redrawing the map of what people even thought the world was. And for the next few years, the pace is just relentless. Alexander is hunting down his rival, Bessus, and planting new cities to lock down his power. One of them is even called Alexandria Eschgate, which literally means Alexandria the furthest. You can't get more on the nose than that. From there, he turns his sights southeast toward India, a land of legend. And this all comes to a head in 326 BCE at the Hydaspes River. He comes up against King Porus and his war elephants. I mean, just imagine seeing tanks in the ancient world. It was a victory, sure, but it was a brutal, bloody, costly one. It left his army deeply shaken and wondering, is all this glory really worth the price? And this. This is where the unstoppable force finally meets an immovable object. And it's not another army. It's the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of his own men. Seriously, think about it. They've been at war for 8 straight years. They're thousands of miles from home, having already conquered the biggest empire on Earth. So when they get to the Hydaspes River, they mutiny. They just stop. They flat out refuse to march one more step to the east. And for the first time in his entire life, Alexander the Great is forced to turn around. But don't think for a second that the journey home was some kind of victory parade. Oh no. It was a grueling nightmare through harsh deserts and hostile lands, with even more brutal fighting against tribes like the Mali. That once unified army, now it's just simmering with resentment. This long march back to Babylon, the heart of the empire, isn't just a trip, it's a rolling crisis. It's exposing all the deep cracks that were hiding just beneath the surface of Alexander's brand new world. So as Alexander gets back to the heart of his empire in 324 BCE, what happens? Another mutiny, this time from his own veterans. The whole empire is strained to its breaking point. But at the exact same time, totally unknown to the Macedonians, a whole new story is kicking off. Over in India, a brilliant but angry scholar named Chanakya gets insulted by the corrupt Nanda dynasty. He doesn't just get mad, he takes a vow to destroy them, root and branch. And he finds the perfect tool for his revenge, a formidable young man named Chandragupta Maurya. In the shadow of one empire's crisis, another is just beginning to be forged. And then, the moment that changes everything, June 323 BCE, in the palace at Babylon, Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the world, the supposed son of Zeus, a man who is still only 32 years old, is dead. Just like that. The single person holding this gigantic, fragile, global system together is suddenly and irrevocably gone. Instantly, a massive power vacuum rips open. Alexander didn't leave a clear heir, so his most powerful and ambitious generals, the Diadochi they're called, those successors, they start circling like sharks. You've got guys like Perdiccas, his top commander, whose ambition is off the charts. You've got Ptolemy, his clever, cautious childhood friend. And then there are the old-school veterans like Antipater. All of these men helped build the empire, and now every single one of them sees a chance to grab the biggest piece of it for himself.
So they hammer out this very fragile compromise called the Partition of Babylon. They make Perdiccas the regent for the whole empire. But let's be real, this thing collapses almost immediately. Perdiccas wants to hold it all together under his rule, but the other generals, they want their own kingdoms. The clash was inevitable, and the result wasn't just politics. It was immediate, all-out civil war. The first war of the successors had begun. And while Alexander's empire is busy tearing itself apart, the old Greek world decides to make one last desperate grab for freedom. In the Licinian War, Athens leads a revolt against Macedonian control, but it gets decisively crushed by Antipater in 322 BCE. And that defeat, that was it. That was the final tragic end of classical Greek independence. As if to close the book on an entire era, that very same year, Alexander's old teacher, the philosopher Aristotle, dies in exile. A whole world of both power and ideas was just fading away. So that first war among the successors, it ends with Perdiccas, the regent, being murdered by his own men during a botched invasion of Egypt. The winners get together again in 321 BCE to split up the empire all over again. They call it the Treaty of Tripartisus. But this wasn't about restoring unity. No, this was about carving up the corpse of an empire. Ptolemy secures his prize, Egypt. Antigonus gets a huge chunk of Asia. The dream of one single unified world empire? Yeah, that's officially dead. But one empire's chaos is another's opportunity. Remember Chandragupta? Well, with the Macedonians in the West completely consumed by their own civil war, he makes his move. In 321 BCE, he seizes the throne of the powerful Magda kingdom, kicking out the Nanda dynasty for good. Guided by Chanakya's ruthless playbook, he starts methodically unifying India. And he's not just building an army, he's building a sophisticated centralized government. Right from the ashes of Alexander's far-flung conquests, a new unified superpower is being born. While a new empire is consolidating in the East, another rising power out West is about to learn a very brutal lesson. In that very same pivotal year, 321 BCE, the Roman Republic suffers one of its most humiliating defeats ever. At a place called the Caudine Forks, an entire Roman army gets trapped by the Samnites. They're forced to disarm and march under the yoke, a ritual designed for absolute submission. This was a disaster and near catastrophic failure that honestly could have broken them. And this is the crucial difference. This is what sets Rome apart. Where Alexander's successors responded to a crisis by turning on each other and fragmenting, Rome responded to its own disaster with pure, grim determination. Defeat didn't break them, it hardened them. They learned, they adapted, they rebuilt, and they were driven by this relentless will to make sure a humiliation like that would never, ever happen again. That resilience, that would come to define them. So let's just zoom out for a second and look at the new world map in 320 BCE. Alexander's single unified empire is gone. In its place, you have these warring successor kingdoms just squabbling over the leftovers. But look closer. On the edges, two new, incredibly disciplined and methodical powers are on the rise. A unified Mauryan Empire in India and that terrifyingly resilient Roman Republic in Italy. The entire geopolitical landscape has been turned completely upside down. This single decade from 329 to 320 BCE was one of the most volatile periods in all of human history. We saw the spectacular collapse of one world order and the violent birth of several new ones. And it leaves us with this really powerful question. When a world is shattered, who has the will to pick up the pieces? The warring successors, the unifying Mauryans, and the resilient Romans each gave a vastly different answer. And their choices would go on to shape the next 1,000 years of history. So what you're looking at here, this is the world redrawn by a single man, Alexander the Great. By 323 BCE, he had carved out an empire on a scale nobody had ever even dreamed of, linking Europe and Asia into one single, massive domain. But in that very same year, right there in Babylon, at the absolute heart of his new world, Alexander died. And in doing so, he didn't just leave a legacy, he left the largest power vacuum in history. And with no clear successor, Alexander's empire wasn't a legacy to be inherited. Oh no, it was a prize to be torn apart. The whole idea of a unified Hellenistic world pretty much died right there with him. His most powerful, most ambitious generals, the Diadochi, which literally means the successors, they immediately started circling like vultures. The question was never if the empire would shatter, but who was going to walk away with the biggest pieces. And believe me, the fracturing was immediate.
and it was brutal. Those first few years were just a storm of betrayal. The regent, who was supposed to hold things together, Perdiccas, assassinated by his own officers. Alexander's half-brother and co-ruler, Philip III, murdered. This was not some clean, orderly transition of power. This was a bloody, chaotic free-for-all that plunged the entire known world into decades of nonstop war. Out of that chaos, titans emerged. You had men like Antigonus Monothelmus, the one-eyed, who wanted to lock down the Asian heartland. And then you have Cassander, fighting for the throne back in Macedon. Now, Cassander, he's a special case. You want to know how ruthless these guys were? To secure his claim, in 316 BCE, he besieged and executed Olympias, Alexander the Great's own mother. That one act tells you everything you need to know about the stakes and the monstrous ambition of these men.
So by the time we get to 315 BCE, the first round of backstabbing and skirmishes is over. The lines have been drawn across the map. That first frantic scramble for power has settled into hardened fronts, and all the major players have pretty much consolidated their turf. The stage was now set for the biggest conflict the world had yet seen, the Third War of the Diadochi. And this wasn't just some regional conflict. We're talking total war, stretching all the way from Greece to the borders of Persia. The other successors, they all ganged up in a coalition against the growing power of Antigonus. But let's be clear, they weren't fighting to preserve Alexander's vision. Heck no. They were fighting to carve out their own kingdoms from its corpse. Millions of people were caught in the middle of a continent-spanning death match between the egos of a handful of men. It is so easy to get completely lost in the sheer scale of this war, right? But history, well, it rarely moves in a straight line. So let's pull the camera back for a second, because while Alexander's successors were literally tearing his empire apart, new powers were quietly being built in the shadows of all that chaos. You see, while his rivals were all locked in this brutal struggle for the heartland, one of Alexander's commanders, a guy named Seleucus, he saw an opportunity somewhere else entirely. Instead of fighting for scraps in the west, he turned his gaze east, toward the vast, wealthy eastern provinces. And he started with the ancient seat of power itself, Babylon. Now, Seleucus's invasion of Babylonia in 312 BCE wasn't just another battle. This was a game changer. This marks the birth of a whole new empire, the Seleucid Empire, and the beginning of a brand new historical period. It was a permanent shift on the world map, creating this powerful Eastern Hellenistic state that would go on to shape the entire region for the next 250 years. Meanwhile, way over on the Italian peninsula, a completely different kind of power was growing. The Roman Republic was in the middle of its own nasty fight, the Samnite Wars, but the way they expanded was different. You see, where the Diadochi fought just to possess huge territories, Rome fought to integrate and solidify them. It was methodical, deliberate. While they were fighting, they were also building, constructing legendary infrastructure like the Via Appia, the first of their great roads, literally binding their conquests together in a way the squabbling successors could never even imagine. And if you go even further east, there's another power vacuum being filled, this one left by Alexander's campaigns, which had basically shattered all the local powers. A truly visionary leader named Chandragupta Maurya was uniting this whole patchwork of states across the Indian subcontinent, and he was rapidly forging the Mauryan Empire, one of the largest and most sophisticated empires that region would ever see. And that just perfectly sums up this entire decade, doesn't it? The era of a single world-conquering figure was over. In the rubble of Alexander's empire, a new multipolar world was being born, all at the same time, in Greece, in Persia, in Italy, and in India. Okay, so let's snap back to the Hellenistic world. After years of this, the warring giants were just exhausted. By 311 BCE, they actually agreed to a temporary peace, this fragile treaty where they all recognized each other's territories. For a brief, fleeting moment, the constant warfare paused, and it almost seemed like some kind of stability might return. But this peace was built on a cynical, dark reality. The treaty was just a political tool. It gave Cassander the quiet moment he needed to commit his final definitive act of treason. He ordered the murder of Alexander's teenage son and rightful heir, Alexander IV, along with his mother, Roxanne. And just like that, the direct bloodline of Alexander the Great was extinguished. Forever. So yeah, the peace was a lie. It didn't even last. The very next year, 310 BCE, the wars ignite all over again. In Sicily, the tyrant Agathocles of Syracuse just resumes his war against Carthage. and even launches this daring invasion of Africa. The truth wasn't peace. It was just everyone catching their breath before the next round of violence. So think about where we are. Alexander's family is dead. His empire is just a collection of warring states, and all across the globe, new powers are rising. The classical world is gone. This violent, chaotic, and unbelievably transformative new era, the Hellenistic Age, is just getting started. And the question it leaves us with is, what kind of world is going to be forged in all this fire?
So, what happens when a man who people basically thought of as a god dies? What on earth happens to the world he conquered? In 323 BCE, Alexander the Great left behind an absolutely massive empire, stretching all the way from Greece to India. But here's the kicker. He didn't leave a clear heir. What he really left behind was a giant, world-sized question. Who was going to be next? Who would dare to claim that legacy?
Okay, so let's get right into it. This wasn't some simple handover of power. No, what Alexander left behind was a full-blown war. A brutal, globe-spanning free-for-all fought by his own generals, the Diadochi, which literally just means the successors. For more than a decade, they schemed, they betrayed, and they battled it out. And by 309 BCE, this bloody game was reaching its savage endgame. So first up, in the heartland of Macedon itself, you've got this guy, Cassander. He was ambitious, he was utterly ruthless, and he was dead set on grabbing Alexander's throne for himself. Now, while a lot of the other generals were getting distracted by the shiny riches of the East, Cassander, he was smart. He focused on the real source of power, the Macedonian homeland. And he was going to let absolutely nothing or no one get in his way. And this is where it gets really dark. In 309 BCE, Cassander makes a move that is just final. He orders the murder of Alexander's own son, a teenager named Alexander IV, and his wife, Roxana. And just like that, in one brutal act, the direct bloodline of Alexander the Great is gone, wiped out, forever. You see, the game completely changed. It wasn't about being a regent for the rightful king anymore. It was about becoming the king. All right, let's head south, down to the ancient and incredibly wealthy land of Egypt. This is Ptolemy's turf. And Ptolemy, well, he was maybe the cleverest, the shrewdest of the whole bunch. He knew that Egypt's crazy wealth, all that grain and gold, was a huge advantage. But his real masterstroke? Recognizing the power of the sea. His navy was going to be his ticket to dominating the Mediterranean.
And this sets up an absolutely classic showdown, a real clash of titans. You've got the powerful Antigonus the One-Eyed, who basically owned the land with his massive army. And then you have Ptolemy, ruling the waves. So in 309 BCE, Ptolemy doesn't just send a few ships. He personally leads his fleet to hit Antigonus right where it hurts, his coastal territories. It's the perfect picture of that age-old conflict, right? The whale versus the elephant, playing out in real time.
But here's the thing. While Ptolemy and Antigonus are slugging it out over the Mediterranean, there's another major player in the game, a guy whose ambitions were just as vast. Let's look east. This is the kingdom of Seleucus. And let me tell you, after he took back Babylon, he wasn't about to stop there. Oh no, he was looking way further east. He was dreaming of doing what Alexander did, going all the way to the edge of the world, to India.
And this, right here, is where the whole story flips on its head. Because while all these Greek generals were busy squabbling with each other, something incredible was happening in the east. A new force had emerged. A man named Chandragupta Maurya had united India into one colossal empire. We're not talking about some local chieftain here. This guy was a full-fledged emperor, and his armies, they made the Greek forces look tiny in comparison.
So, around 304 BCE, it finally happens. These two worlds crash into each other. Seleucus marches his battle-hardened Macedonian army east, thinking he's going to roll over some scattered provinces, just like Alexander did, but he was in for a rude awakening. He wasn't fighting local tribes. He ran headfirst into the entire Mauryan Empire. And the result? A total disaster for Seleucus. Chandragupta crushed his forces and sent him packing.
But Seleucus, he wasn't a fool. He knew when he was beaten. He cut his losses. He traded territory for peace, even threw in a marriage alliance to seal the deal. But what he got in return, man, it was a game changer. 500 war elephants. And you got to understand, these weren't just big animals. These were the tanks of the ancient world. And suddenly, Seleucus had the biggest tank division in the entire Western world.
Okay, so while all this drama is unfolding in the East, one empire literally tearing itself apart, let's jump all the way over to the West, to Italy, because a new power is being born, forged in the fires of constant, brutal warfare. We're talking about Rome, and they're busy building a completely different kind of war machine, one legion at a time.
And this really gets to the heart of what made the Romans, well, Roman. It was this unbreakable will, this iron discipline, combined with a totally revolutionary way of fighting. Their legions, with those big rectangular shields, were way more flexible than the old Greek phalanx. And this system, this relentless, adaptable machine, was just slowly but surely consuming the Italian peninsula. You can just feel a storm brewing out west, can't you?
Okay, let's swing back to the Greek world, because things are really heating up. After years and years of backstabbing, invasions, you name it, the endgame is finally here. Antigonus the One-Eyed, the guy who still dreamed of putting Alexander's empire back together, he'd just gotten too big for his britches. So his rivals, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus, fresh from his adventure in India, they realized they had to team up. It was time for one last massive throwdown.
And that final showdown all goes down at a place called Ipsus, in what's now Turkey. This wasn't just another battle. This was the battle, the biggest the Hellenistic world had ever seen. Everything was on the line. On one side, you have Antigonus, the old veteran, fighting for that one big, unified empire. And on the other side, you have the coalition, all fighting for their own slice of the pie.
And the result? An absolute catastrophe for Antigonus. I mean, the man was over 80 years old, and he fought right to the very end. But it wasn't enough. His army was shattered, and he was killed right there on the battlefield. And with him, the dream died. The dream of one empire, Alexander's world. It was over. Gone. There was no going back now.
So you gotta ask, what was the secret weapon? What made the difference? Well, remember those elephants? The 500 war elephants Seleucus got from India? This is their moment. This is the payoff. At Ipsus, he unleashes them, and they just obliterate the enemy cavalry. Total chaos. And that chaos is what wins the battle for the coalition. Think about that. A deal made on the Indus River just decided the fate of the Mediterranean.
So the fighting's over. But this didn't bring peace. Not even close. What it did was slam the door on the old world and kick open the door to a new one. See, the Battle of Ipsus wasn't just about drawing new lines on a map. It cemented three totally new ways of thinking about power. Three pillars that would hold up this new age.
First up, something we could call administrative realism. This is a whole new kind of government. It's colder, more calculated. Power isn't just about who your dad was anymore. It's about being ruthlessly efficient. Guys like Chandragupta were perfecting this, building these huge, centralized bureaucracies to run everything. It was all about control and efficiency.
The second big pillar, the professional army. The days of the farmer picking up a spear to defend his city, yeah, those were fading fast. Alexander's father, Philip, really got the ball rolling on this, but now everyone was doing it. States were funding full-time, professional armies. The Phalanx, the Legion, these weren't militias. They were state-of-the-art war machines, built to conquer and control huge, diverse empires.
And third, and this one's fascinating, how do you prove you're the rightful king when you just took the throne by force? The answer? You build stuff. Big stuff. You create these massive monuments, both physical and intellectual, that connect you to something bigger, something timeless. From Plato's Academy organizing how people think, to giant tombs setting a new standard, to pyramids in Mesoamerica linking rulers to the gods. All over the world, leaders were literally cementing their power in stone and big ideas.
So here's the bottom line. That chaotic decade at the end of the 4th century BCE, it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A really violent, world-changing beginning. It didn't just break an empire, it created the blueprint, the template, for the massive, bureaucratic, professional empires that would basically run the world for the next 2,000 years.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Alexander's death unleashed absolute chaos, decades of war and bloodshed. But out of all that destruction, out of those ashes, a new world was born. New empires, new ideas, new everything. So it makes you wonder, right? When an empire forged by one man shatters, is the world broken or is it being reborn?